It's time for the Bible Geek. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, baby, God blasted my spine. Ghost, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek.
Welcome back to the Bible Geek. I trying to keep my promise of a geek a day until the rain barrel is drained, and it's getting down there. And then, of course, I expect it to fill up miraculously, and I'll be back. But let's get to them tonight. How well? This is for 5 questions from Don from Colorado. How well did Muhammad tie into the Jewish and Christian origins? What are the most significant differences in his story, say, up through the end of the ministry of Christ? I know he taught that Jesus was just a prophet and was not divine, but are there other significant differences? Did he teach that the historical aspects of the Jewish and Christian religions were pretty well accurate up through the time he received his revelations? Are the characters in his narrative that do not appear at all in the Christian Bible? That's a lot of good questions right there. Let's see. There was according to Islamic lore, what I think a comet in the sky or some such thing to announce his birth. There is certainly nothing in the early biography of Muhammad, which is over a century after his death, that indicates he was supposed to be a divine incarnation, though popular piety before long did pretty much attribute that to him, that his bright, shining shadow had been with God at the beginning, very much like an incarnational idea. He taught, it is said, I don't really believe any of this, but he taught in the streets of Mecca and gathered a lot of people, including relatives and mainly the poor, and he taught and preached that the final judgment was not far in the future, though we didn't know exactly when. And there was an ascension, but it was a revelatory one before his death. He died, and apparently there was nobody that thought he was raised from the dead, though there might be a hint that we're told, in fact, in some of the hadith, I believe, that when Abu Bakr came out of the tent where the Prophet had died, he said to those who worship Muhammad, Muhammad is dead, but to those who worship Allah, know that Allah lives. And it's been suggested that he was trying to quell rumors that had started immediately that Muhammad had not died. Who knows, though? This is later speculation, but interesting and not surprising. People are very reluctant to let go a founder and a leader. Now, what did he have to say about Jesus? Well, here's a fascinating checklist. I remember once a guy who was hired to teach Islam and African religion. He himself was an African. He made a comment once that Muslims didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah, but merely a prophet. Of course, that's incorrect. They believed that he was a prophet and he was the Messiah, and Muhammad was not. Muhammad was a greater prophet because he was the last of the prophets in their reckoning, but they certainly believed Jesus was the Messiah. What did that really mean? Well, he taught and prophesied to Jews, to Israel. But, and here we go into some differences. They believed that he had not died on the cross. God didn't abandon him to such a fate. Rather, he was taken up before he could be arrested. And one day he will return. And the final judgment, etc., and then he will die and rise in the general resurrection. Pretty interesting. Something I believe is accredited to Cerinthus way back there. Now, they don't believe in Jesus being the Son of God, though there are hints in the Quran that originally some Muslims held a kind of Aryan Christology of Muhammad, Christology of Jesus, that he was the Word of God cast into the womb of Mary, but apparently whoever said this would not have believed that the Word was of one nature with the Father. But later on, though, we just get the idea that he had no personal pre-existence at all, Jesus. They do believe in the virgin birth of Jesus, and then there are two different versions of the Nativity, both kind of like Luke's, in the Quran. Let's see. He taught that the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity were true, though Muslims shortly thereafter claimed that the texts had been corrupt, and references to Muhammad, predictions of Muhammad in the Jewish and Christian scriptures had been removed by Christians. Of course, that can't be true because we actually have copies that are older than Muhammad. But I suspect possibly this began with the belief that the Paraclete predicted by Jesus in the Gospel of John was originally a slightly different word, perikletos, not parakletos, and it meant the illustrious one. And sure enough, in the Quran it says that Jesus predicted the coming of Ahmed, which is the same, really, just a variant version of Muhammad, which means the illustrious one. Maybe that's all they meant. Again, it's not quite true, though the point is still good, because I think that the prediction of the Paraclete was a prediction of a successor prophet to elucidate the teaching of Jesus. Let's see. He has various, or the Quran, I'm not ready to say Muhammad. Of course, Muslims wouldn't say that because they figure Muhammad was just taking dictation from the angel Gabriel, who was reading off the text of the heavenly Quran, the mother of the book, as they call it. But I think that they would say at least that this proceeded out of the mouth of Muhammad and was written down by followers. I tend to doubt that. I think that, it's up for grabs as to whether Muhammad even existed, believe it or not. But even if he did, it seems to me that the Quran itself is simply a bunch of hadith, just things people said Muhammad had said, and there's no way to get back to any original teaching. But there are many places in the Quran where Allah says to Muhammad, "Behold, we reveal to you history that no one has known before." And it's stories about Noah, Moses, Abraham, and so on. They all sound very much like what we hear of Muhammad elsewhere in the Quran, namely that he was heckled and persecuted and so on, and the responses to the heckling even are kind of similar between Moses, Noah, Abraham, and Muhammad. So who knows which one was the prototype. But there are, they're biblical prophets. Interestingly, none of the writing prophets, so-called, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, etc., are ever mentioned in the Quran. The prophetic succession that it does mention is like the Ebionites, and in fact those Jewish Christians probably influenced Islam to a significant degree. They mention, of course, Adam and Enoch, which the Quran calls Idris. There's like Idris Shah, the Sufi, or Idris Elba, the actor, played Heimdall in Thor, and loads of other roles. He's going to be James Bond. Should be good as that. Let's see. And then Abraham, not Isaac, but Ishmael, and eventually David and Jesus, and so on. But there are other prophets they mention, like Hud and Ad, A.D., and Salih, and so forth. And these aren't mentioned in the Bible, or are they? Because Robert Eisenman has a fascinating theory that Hood is Theudas, and who was another name for Thomas, and so on. That Ad is Adai, and who's another name for the same guy, another version of the name. And that Salih means the just, and maybe the same as Silas. Interesting possibility. I believe the Queen of Sheba is mentioned, Pharaoh is mentioned, of course the Virgin Mary, and so on. So there is an awful lot of overlap based on people's knowledge of the Bible, whether from having read it, because there was no Arabic translation when the Quran was written, or just hearing it in Syrian churches. So interesting. Okay, second one. I'm curious about how the apologists deal with the Tower of Babel story when compared to our landing on the moon and Voyager leaving the solar system. If the Tower of Babel pissed God off, then he must be furious over our current space activities. Well, your instinct is correct, because I remember when I guess I didn't see this, though I do remember the moon landing. I was around for that and saw that on TV, but later on in a documentary I saw people having been interviewed back then, and some bunch of fundamentalists, while the Apollo 13 was on its way to the moon, these people are saying, oh, God is going to swat it out of the sky. They'll never make it, because it says in the Bible, the heavens are the Lord's, the earth he has given to the sons of men. I think that's Tower of Babel thinking there, that there's nothing human beings won't be able to do, but God doesn't want them to do it. And he wants to keep them down. And with Voyager, I don't know if they've said the same thing, or if any fundamentalists still believe this, because obviously God didn't swat the thing out of the sky. But yeah, some have made the kind of connection you're talking about. Let's see, third, I've always thought that the prohibitions on saying the name of God or questioning him in any way was an attempt by his prophets to keep people from looking too closely at the inconsistencies in their stories. What do you think? It reminds me of the Wizard of Oz and his "don't look behind the curtain" comment. Well, I think that is a major element of the Tower of Babel story and the Tree of Knowledge story, that God, for some reason, does not want his creations to advance and realize their full potential, because then they will make his position insecure. As we might say, they will realize they don't need a God, but they will become gods. That's Jehovah's worry in the Garden of Eden. And of course, they do, right? They have become like one of us, and that's kind of the humanist battle cry. You don't really need God because human beings have become gods. The name thing, not taking the name of Yahweh, your God, in vain, that does seem to have a different intent. That is an attempt to prevent people from swearing falsely in court, taking an oath, and as Yahweh lives, I didn't steal his camel. But if you did, you're invoking the name in vain. It was also an attempt to stop breach of contract. As Yahweh lives, I'll have the carpentry done by the first of the month and with this budget ceiling, and then you don't. You've taken the name in vain. It's possible it intended some kind of magical incantator use of the name, and later on Jews thought it did, but since nobody was that sure what it intended, they later decided, well, what the heck, let's just prohibit it being said at all, which is not what the third commandment says. But they were saying, let's play it safe. If we don't quite know what would be a proper and a vain or improper or empty use, maybe we just better not use it at all. And that's why the guy got in such trouble, Matthias, son of Deuteronomy of Gath, in the life of Brian. But all I said was, this halibut is good enough for Jehovah. not supposed to say that, I guess. 4, how do the apologists deal with the different animals in America and Australia that could not have gotten on the ark? I don't know, but I think I have read that they say that this is not evidence of continental drift and independent lines of evolution. God just decided he'd like to do things a little differently in Australia. Because their argument, oddly, seems to, like they're willing to admit, it kind of looks like these creatures, the different species, did evolve from one another, but they didn't because of Genesis. So God, it simply is that God is varying his favorite design as he creates each new species. Again, anything's possible, but what's probable? Yeah. 5, how do the apologists deal with the size of the universe and the speed of light? Since we can see things that are 13.5 billion light years away, it had to take that light 13.5 billion years to get to us. How do they reconcile that with a universe that is only 6,000 years old? Well, some of them say that the speed of light has changed. The creationists are always on the warpath against uniformitarianism, the idea that natural laws have always worked as they do now, which, of course, without that assumption, without that axiom, you can't do any science, much less history. But they figure, it could have happened, so it did. And God changed it some way so that actually it didn't take that long. Or another version I've heard creationists use is that God made the world in medias res, if that's the word, that he made it just like Adam was made with a belly button, they figure, even though he had never had an umbilical cord attached to him. Likewise, the universe was made with light in transit, never having left the stars that now project light in the same trajectory. It was like stage scenery. It was created as if it was the light was coming from those stars. Pretty clever. Incredible. As I always say, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to believe. Okay, this is an interesting perspective on this one. Let's see. This is from Brice Denise in Paris. I thought you would be interested in the point of view of a local Frenchman on the recent terrorist killings in Paris. The most surprising aspect is that the magazine that became the symbol of Western freedom of speech was going to close the following month. It was no longer read by anybody. It was even widely despised, including by its former subscribers. Charlie Hebdo used to be fun, though. It was founded in the early 70s, a very special era when any provocation was considered a brilliant innovation and somehow made sense politically. Maybe someday, Dr. Price, you will have time to tell us some of your memories of the hippie era as well. Well, I liked the music, but I was always an old man and thought the hippies were a bunch of lazy degenerates. However, the fun of Charlie Hebdo was long gone. I'm not sure what the equivalent would be in the U.S., but you can imagine a tired, white-haired anarchist, Marxist, ecologist, leftist, who is now completely out of touch with the real concerns of the population, who makes huge winks at you just because he has smoked a joint, who believes he has triggered worldwide revolution because he has drawn a naked body on a piece of paper, and who keeps calling everybody a fascist all the time. Maybe you have that type in the U.S. too. Oh, you know it, buddy. It's a lot of them in universities. Therefore, it was a bit ironic that as large a part of the world was shouting, "Je suis Charlie," They were meaning that they stood for democracy, but the phrase could also be interpreted as, I am a big, ugly failure, and I justify as a contempt of the Islamic world toward a decadent Western world. Ooh, that's good. Or to make it simpler, suppose you hear on TV that a guy named Joe has been killed by religious activists, so you join the demonstration shouting, I am Joe, thinking that Joe was some sort of brilliant writer, and a bit later you learn that Joe was in fact a local barfly whose only atheism consisted in making sex jokes about nuns. Which brings me to my question. I heard that soon after the killings, Pope Francis declared that people should not insult religions. I would sort of agree, except I found the timing very inappropriate. Let's take the example of Joe the Barfly again. Suppose that in addition to making sex jokes about nuns, Joe is destroying himself with alcohol, and when he is drunk he becomes really obnoxious. If nothing else is happening in Joe's life, you are fully justified in saying that he shouldn't behave like that. Now suppose that Joe has just been killed in the street after walking out of a bar completely drunk, and at that moment you say, well, he should never have got drunk in the first place. Isn't that a totally different attitude? You express the same condemnation of alcoholism and obnoxious behavior, but the murders that just happened before gives your words a different meaning, doesn't it? I'm asking this question because I noticed that after the killing, some devout Christian circles, not only in Catholicism, had an ambiguous reaction. They condemned the murders as wrong, but they also said that the victims were wrong. Quelle est votre opinion, cher professeur? Probably butchered that. This same thing has occurred in the period after you wrote this. As I say, it's taken me an awful long time to get to all these questions. We've had the same thing with a contest in Texas. Draw a cartoon of Muhammad, which was, as they say, clearly just an attempt to stick the American finger in the eye of these Muslims. And it was waving the red flag before the bull. They were inviting, many people said, some sort of retaliation, which almost happened. As you know, a guard saw these two gun-toting Islamists and in time to shoot them down, and there was no terrorist act, but there almost was. Hadn't Pam Geller and the others who organized this invited that? Well, in a sense, yeah. They're in a sense they're trying to smoke them out. To goad them. In fact, it's something like what happened during the Gulf War, when American troops would approach a town and over bullhorns and loudspeakers say, the Iraqi men are impotent, they can't get it up. Well, this infuriated these guys so much they charged out and were shot down like shooting fish in a barrel. In a way, it is also like a sting operation. You're trying to get these jerks to show what they really are, though, of course, there's no doubt about that. Maybe it's a way of getting sleeper agents out there so you can see them and shoot them. But others say, well, so some say it's unwise. It's paradoxical because you're goading these people into the very behavior you're bemoaning. So you're as much at fault as they are. That's why Ismailis and others have practiced what they call heavenly deception, or the doctrine of dissimulation, that the Sufis had to do this, because Al-Hallaj went out once saying that he said, I am the truth, which correctly was understood as a declaration of his own godhood, but What they didn't understand was he didn't mean he personally was the truth or Allah. He meant everybody is. So he was confessing that. But of course they figured that was blasphemy too. And the Sufi community learned a lesson from that and said, look, let's keep it to ourselves and anybody else that appears to be ready to hear it, because otherwise, don't go blabbing the gnosis, because you know what people are going to say. They're not ready to hear this yet. They're going to think it's blasphemy and they're not going to put up with it, so you're goading them into murdering you, as they did Al-Hallaj, and so it's their fault, but it's also your fault because you put them up to it. Well, that reaction, I think, was given Pam Geller's event, but others came out with an interesting argument that if you tread so lightly, you're letting these jerks win, that it's important to show defiance, which I guess I kind of come down on that side. I think that may be right. I mean, you still might question whether it is worth the risk to your own safety, but in principle, I kind of see their point, that it's good to outrage these jerks and bring the thing to a boil. I guess that's what I'm thinking currently. I got to be persuaded differently, of course. Ward Thomas in Virginia requests a Yiddish accent. I'm fascinated by the concept that the Jewish forefathers in early times engaged in child sacrifice of the firstborn. Your Human Bible Podcast Episode 2 blew my mind when it went into this. More recently, your April 8, 2015 Bible Geek podcast had a question from Loretto Taylor, in which he suggested that the Jewish prohibition of child sacrifice was intended to lure pagan wives of Jews from their religions practicing child sacrifice. He responded that the Jews themselves practiced it and later abandoned the practice, as reflected in the story of Abraham and Isaac. But why did change? Loretto offered one plausible reason. As you indicated in the Human Bible podcast, it would seem the Jews themselves would have welcomed the change that would allow them to keep their firstborn children or grandchildren. Another possible reason involves the priests. The sacrifice of burnt animals would have been more enticing as food to the priests than the burnt flesh of babies, to the extent that the priests ate the offerings, so the elimination of child sacrifice would have been something of a win-win situation, it seems to me. Wherefore, the discontinuation of child sacrifice, what thinketh the geek? I think that it's either a growing sensitivity that nobody can have done this without great regret. I love the way the movie The Bible, made in the 60s, depicts George C. Scott as Abraham struggling with God's order to sacrifice his son, the torture the guy goes through. I don't think it's modernizing to suggest nobody could have been okay with that. Think of, what is it, Psalm? I can never remember, Psalm 139 or one of these, when the Jewish Levitical singer and harpist is in the Babylonian exile and is ruminating on his situation and how the Babylonians and the Edomites destroyed Jerusalem and so on, and after all this great lyrical poetry of devotion to God, the psalmist says, happy shall, and he's talking to the Edomites and the Babylonians in his imagination. He says, happy shall he be who dashes your little ones against the rock. Apparently they mean as you did to ours. You know, and you have to think that this was considered horrendous even at that time. You can come up with economic reasons for that. The levirate marriage laws showed how concerned people were to have heirs to inherit their land and keep their name going. So there must have been a lot of hesitation to have a firstborn son and then kill him. So eventually they just decided, okay, no more of this. God commanded it, but he's willing to take an animal substitute. That's what I would guess anyway. Let's see. This from Les Zombie Jesus in Dayton, Ohio. You think that's a pen name? Anyway, to establish that no man has seen God the Father, quote unquote, in his video, Matt Slick interviews Mormons. Let's see, it's on YouTube. Christian apologist Matt Slick quotes 1 Timothy 6:16. Who only hath immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, whom no man hath seen nor can see. Next he states, in the Old Testament, Slick says, the God, quote unquote, that is seen is the pre-incarnate Christ, unquote. I think Margaret Barker would go along with that. To further make this point, Slick quotes Jesus in John 6:46. Not that any man hath seen the Father, save he which is of God, he hath seen the Father. He also states, Moses saw the pre-incarnate Christ. Finally, when asked if Moses saw God, he says, yes, that was Exodus 3:11. And Moses said unto God, who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? Does the Old Testament support Matt Slick's inference about the Old Testament God being the incarnate Christ? Are you aware of any passages in the Old or New Testament that support or contradict Matt Slick's assertions? Well, as I've already intimated, I think the only way this makes sense, and it does make sense this way, is by the theory of Margaret Barker in her great book, The Great Angel, a study of Israel's second God, in which she says that it looks like the early Christians understood Jesus as Jehovah or Yahweh, and his father was El Elyon. The two were distinguished in Deuteronomy 32 and so on. El Elyon means God Most High, and there are 70 sons of El, and Yahweh is one of them. And she says that though this was kind of ruled out by the Deuteronomic reform, which combined Yahweh and El Elyon and so on, which I think happened much later, much more recently in the time of the Hasmoneans. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm dealing with that in a book. These older beliefs remained alive among the common people, and that the early Jewish Christians still believed there was a difference between Elyon and Yahweh. And as I say, that Jesus was Yahweh, his father was El Elyon, and that Jesus was believed to be a theophany, an appearance among men, I would say an avatar of Yahweh appearing on earth. And I went into this in yesterday's Geek a bit. And in that case, she says this would be like the theophanies in the Old Testament, where the angel of God or the angel of Yahweh appears to people. And Mrs. Manoah and Hagar both say, they see the angel of Yahweh, and then say, have I really seen Yahweh and lived to tell it? And so that they understood Jesus as one of these. So it's not so much that they were seeing Jesus in the Old Testament as that when the early Christians saw Jesus, they thought, this is Jehovah in a theophany like in the old days. So I doubt if Mr. Slick, with whose work I happen not to be familiar, would like much of what Margaret Barker says. But if she's correct, as I imagine she is, then yeah, oddly enough, what he says would have some real basis on that point. Okay. This from Charles Coletta. Is Bar Kokhba related literarily to the Nativity of Jesus? Is the star that the Magi use as a guide a subtle or overt use of the former Jewish rebel as one of many other characters who couldn't be erased from contemporary memory, who presuppose and make way for the coming of Jesus? Let me just pause there. I doubt it, though I think there is a connection. The star they see is no doubt supposed to be the fulfillment of the Balaam prophecy way back in Numbers about the star that will rise and all of that. And then Bar Kokhba, his name was a pseudonym based on the same prophecy. It meant the son of the star. The man's name originally, his birth name was Simon or Simeon Bar Kosiba. It gets to be a mess because some say that was a pejorative epithet used by Jews who didn't believe him, since that would mean son of the lie. But at any rate, I don't know, Bar Kokhba, the son of the star, is like a messianic epithet. And so they're both related, I think, to the star prophecy in Numbers. Let's see, and now back to Charles. I've been thinking lately of the social developments and historical material at the time of the 1st and 2nd centuries, and it's becoming more simple and deep to conclude that the Gospels post-date the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Between Eisenman's Qumran theory and your Simon Magus Paul hypothesis, the Gospels are a result, it seems, of developing theology, Judeo-Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, and material conditions which demanded further and firmer acceptance of Roman rule. Is there any evidence Mark would have been the Gospel of Mark would have been a play, a simplistic rendering of first-century history and Marcionite Christianity, and Mark and Luke stepped up, Matthew and Luke stepped up to challenge it via different media with their ideas of what's best? I'm not sure how much evidence there is, but William Benjamin Smith, many decades ago, did argue that the written gospel, Mark or whatever underlay it, was actually a play. And I think he thought that Jesus represented Israel and wasn't a historical person, but was depicted that way in this play. I think Bishop Spong, a couple of decades ago, suggested that the nativity story in Luke may have begun as a kind of a nativity play. Interesting possibility. It's also been argued pretty believably that the book of Revelation is the libretto for a play. But I don't think that's held by too many, but that doesn't mean much. So I'm not sure what evidence there would be, but except that it does obviously have similarities to the mystery plays of the dying and rising gods, though of course there's a whole lot more to Mark than just that element. But it could be, and some people have thought so. So good thinking. Art Caminio in the wonderfully named Satellite Beach, Florida. That's great. This quote from Bart Ehrman's book Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, page 191, seems to slam some of the work of the Jesus Seminar. Any comment? And here it is. Even though there was a major city within easy walking distance of Nazareth, the much-discussed city of Sepphoris, it is never mentioned in any of our ancient gospel records. This should perhaps give us pause when considering the widespread claim today among certain scholars, including a number of those associated with the Jesus Seminar, that Jesus would have been intimately familiar with Greek philosophical traditions, especially those associated with the Cynics, from his many trips to Sepphoris. What trips to Sepphoris? I don't know that Jesus. I don't remember hearing anybody in the Jesus Seminar suggest that he'd actually been there. What I have read in Burton Mack and David Seeley and John Dominic Crossan, all of whom kind of see Jesus as a cynic or cynic-like sage, is that Sepphoris is evidence that Galilee had a lot of Hellenistic influence, and that it's very likely Jesus growing up there would have been somewhat familiar with it. It's not like suggesting he knew about Shintoism or something. This is part of a larger disagreement Bart would have with the, I guess what you might say is the official position of the Jesus Seminar, that Jesus was not an apocalyptic preacher, as Schweitzer and Bultmann had said, and as Bart still thinks. Some seminar members believe that, like Richard Arthur, for instance, but they like the idea of Jesus as a cynic-like sage, and they think that the apocalyptic element was added probably during the war against Rome, a generation later, by Christians at that time. And so you have to see what he says in a slightly bigger perspective, that he sees it as part of the cynic hypothesis, which rejects apocalypticism, and he is diametrically opposed to that view. It's kind of funny. I've heard Jesus Seminar fellows say that Bart Ehrman ought to come to the seminar and would be welcome, that he's a critic, they're critics. They don't have an official party line, and his input would be welcome. I'm sure that's still the case. Let's see. Ty from Texas says, do we get any sense anywhere in the Bible that demons can read our minds? It would seem that if they can't, then they couldn't tempt us adequately. I would imagine maybe the concept is supposed to be that they're constantly watching us and waiting to see what our vices are, and then they somehow put the object in front of us. Would you say this is the idea? I don't know that we get in the Bible the idea that demons are tempters. There's the notion that Satan, both in the Old and the New Testaments, whose name means the adversary in a courtroom sense, that he tempts people in order to test them. But it's usually very important people like King David, Job, who's pictured as almost a king, Joshua, the high priest in post-exilic Judah, a candidate for the high priest, and then he becomes it, and of course Jesus and Peter and the 12. Simon, Satan has demanded his right to sift you all as wheat, and so on. So the apostles, but you get the impression that, I guess the closest that the New Testament comes to this is in the book of Revelation, when it celebrates the fall of Satan and says that the accuser of our brethren is cast down. Now, it wouldn't be surprising if he accused people of sins that he had tempted them to do, and I believe that the Quran does have that scenario explicitly, that on the last day in the judgment, the demons will testify, we tempted him and these idiots fell for it. And the prophets will show up and say, we warned them, but they didn't take heed. But I don't think the New Testament sees demons that way. Rather, demons are an explanation for epilepsy and other the others may have thought that. I think the Book of Jubilees implies that the demons who were not imprisoned in Tartarus were needed by Satan to tempt human beings, but I don't see that in the New Testament. Let's see. Diabolical Doug from Chicago, Illinois has a couple of questions. One. What would have prompted biblical authors, in quotes, to designate King Ahab evil? Do we have any evidence that that he had anything to do with issues beyond his association with Jezebel? We have a king linked to what might have been mythological ancestors, David and Solomon, who's expanding his hold over a territory by fortifying cities. But some time after he's passed, the people writing the history of the time take the credit away from him and give it to one of his ancestors. Not only does his ancestor get the credit for building his cities, he gets to have an empire that far surpasses his own. It's almost as if the history of Solomon was written to reduce Ahab's achievements. Is there anything in the Bible that would point to this? Not that I know of, though it could well be. But like Solomon is vilified also, of course, because from a later standpoint, the idea of him building chapels for his many wives who were the daughters of kings of other states with whom he was making marriage alliances, they figured, well, that meant Solomon was a polytheist and an idolater, so much for his wisdom. And so he becomes a bad guy in the eyes of later biblical writers, though he's introduced as an extreme good guy. Ahab is addressed by Elijah as, Elijah says to him, is it you, you troubler of Israel? And Elijah says, well, I know you are, but what am I? And what do we see Ahab doing? Well, he's weak-kneed and henpecked, and he agrees to... he's coveting the field and garden, the vineyard of Naboth, or Naboth, I guess you should say. And he's whining about it, and Jezebel Rodham says to him, hey, look, you're the king. If you want it, take it. And they set up false witnesses to accuse him of capital crimes, and they execute Naboth, and Ahab takes the property. Hey, he's a jerk. What a creep, right? And but I suppose the big problem that they had with him was he allowed Jezebel to introduce the worship of Baal Melkart, Hercules, into Israel alongside that of Yahweh. And Elijah is shown, of course, not liking that, and that's a little different than what Solomon did, even, right? This was for his scheme was just to be considerate to his wives who didn't convert to Israelite faith, but Jezebel was actively promoting the worship of this Philistine deity in Israel, and that would be enough for Ahab to have gone along with that. That would have certainly made him a bad guy in the eyes of the biblical writers. Another question from Diabolical Doug. We know that in other cultures, ruling dynasties have created heroic or divine ancestors as a way to establish their historical credibility. The Norman conquerors of England were reputedly descended from a Norse god. The Merovingian kings of France were descended from a German deity. If Ahab was trying to establish a new ruling dynasty, he might have created or linked himself to a mythological figure or family like David and Solomon. Could an early form of the history of Israel, especially the reigns of David and Solomon, have been written during the reign of Ahab as a way to enhance his standing? Could be. I mean, the Deuteronomic history does say it is borrowing material from books like the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, or of Israel and Judah, and so forth. That may just be a literary device, but if it isn't, that could be a good example of just what you're talking about, that these things were written to show what a glorious heritage Ahab or whatever king had. A modern partial parallel would be Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan the Terrible, popularizing the atrocities of Vlad the Impaler, which is how come we know about Dracula at all. And because Vlad was revered as a national hero in Transylvania for saving the country from a Muslim invasion. How did he do it? He was in the habit of impaling people, presumably on some charges. So what he did was, when the Muslims were on the way, he put up a bunch of stakes on the road outside of the city and impaled a bunch of people. And when the Muslims got there and took a look at it, they said, maybe we better not fool with this guy. Let's go conquer some other place. And so he was revered as a national hero. And Ivan the Terrible was a real monster also. And he figured that he could get some mystique being like Vlad the Impaler. Oh, maybe he's not so bad. The same way Putin is admired by most Russians today, though he's a villain. So, Eddie says, about 2 years ago, I started to really study the Bible more intently when I became caught up in the Hebrew roots movement. After all, I had to know what I was talking about if I was going to prove all those pagan Christians wrong. They go so far as to... the Hebrew roots movement goes so far as to teach that Paul was really teaching his converts to keep the Torah. My question is, can a plain reading of Paul's epistles be interpreted like this? What are your thoughts on the so-called Hebrew roots movement? Eddie, I never heard of it, though I have heard of something similar, a Noahic movement or something, where a bunch of like Baptists have decided to go back to a kind of Judaism as sort of second-hand Jews. The covenant with Noah set forth just a handful of laws, and later rabbis figured, well, that's really all God holds Gentiles responsible for. But at any rate, this is a Judaizing movement, obviously. And it seems to me that you can't really say that in the Pauline epistles the Gentile readers are being told to keep the Torah. There's no way you could read Galatians that way. It seems to assume that Gentile Christians shouldn't do it, and if they do, Christ will be of no use to them, it says. But I know some, like, I think maybe it was Caird, Principal Caird, and his student James D.G. Dunn have argued that in Romans, Paul is actually not saying the law has passed away. And when he says that Jesus Christ is the end of the law for everyone who believes, the word is telos, which can mean goal of the law. Now, that could mean that the law was predicting Jesus and he's the fulfillment, but it also says something like that Christ died so that the righteous requirement of the law could be fulfilled in us. Now, most Protestants go coach. No, most Protestants think that means that because Jesus fulfilled the law by being perfectly righteous, but then died for our sins, he took care of the debt we owed to the law, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. And I suspect that is the point, but, that's all I can say. But Dunn says no, for the the righteous requirement of the law to be fulfilled in us or by us means that we are heirs of the new covenant that Jeremiah mentioned. The law will be written on our hearts, which means it will be second nature to obey it. It won't be something we're liable to forget or some burden under which we chafe. It will be written in our hearts, so we will perfectly obey it. And that's what Christ has done by inaugurating the new covenant. So that we are to keep the Torah, because now we can. I believe Dunn reads Romans that way, and it's possible. I don't think so, but it's not a crazy view. And it does seem like Matthew wants Jewish and Gentile Christians to keep the Torah. I don't see any way around that. So there's not a... it's not like they've got no leg to stand on. Then Eddie has another one. I've heard you mention these passages about seething a kid in its mother's milk several times without a satisfactory explanation, it seems. Yeah, you're exactly right. I always said, I don't know what this means. Here's the English Standard Version. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Exodus 34:26b. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Deuteronomy 14:21b. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Well, seething, not quite the same thing as boiling, I'm told. I don't know the difference. Could this have been part of a pagan fertility ritual of some kind, or a command not to slaughter an animal before it's weaned? What do you make of this? Well, the latter sounds pretty good to me, though actually, since I professed my profound ignorance, I reread some Gerhard von Rad, and he says, thanks to Ugaritic texts, it's now clear that yes, boiling a kid in its mother's milk, a baby goat, of course, was part of a Canaanite magic ritual. Okay, case closed. I'm glad we got that one solved. Okay, now here's a bit of a long one, but mighty interesting. This is from, where's that name? Oh, gosh, come on now. Alexander. Ah, yes, all right. Just had to scroll down enough. I happened to read Wikipedia about Crete, which in the Flora and Fauna section says, Crete is isolated from mainland Europe, Asia, and Africa, and this is reflected in the diversity of the fauna and flora. Those were two of the Princess Aurora's guardians, weren't they? As a result, the fauna and flora of Crete have many clues to the evolution of species. There are no animals that are dangerous to humans on the island of Crete in contrast to other parts of Greece. Indeed, the ancient Greeks attributed the lack of large mammals, such as bears, wolves, jackals, and poisonous snakes, to the labor of Hercules, who took a live Cretan bull to the Peloponnese. Hercules wanted to honor the birthplace of Zeus by removing all harmful and poisonous animals from Crete. Later, Cretans believed that the island was cleared of dangerous creatures by the Apostle Paul, who lived on the island of Crete for 2 years with his exorcisms and blessings. End of quote. It's interesting, by the way, that the description of Paul in the Acts of Paul, though not very flattering by modern standards, is very close to the way Hercules was described by the ancients. So did people make him a Christian Hercules? Anyway, then I wondered if there were never poisonous snakes on Malta, where Acts 28:3 has St. Paul allegedly bitten by a viper. I found an article on Times of Malta website by Stephen Mifsud. Which viper bit St. Paul in Malta? Let's see. St. Paul was bitten by a viper right in front of a group of awestruck natives on the island of Melita, who, same thing I assume, who knew very well how venomous the particular snake was and so expected the victim to swell up or fall down dead. Since he remained unharmed, they concluded that he was a god, Acts 28:5. Centuries later, and even today, readers of the Bible still rely on the witnessing natives' expertise and their familiarity with the viper species as proof of the veracity of the miracle. The fact that there are no records of venomous snakes ever existing in Malta capable of causing such severe symptoms has created a problem in identifying it with the island of Melita described in the Bible. There are several Maltese Pauline traditions, many of which are several centuries old, that explain away the anomaly with the miraculous abilities of the saint. Boy, I'd love to get a book containing those stories. A frequent reason given is that the preaching of St. Paul caused the snakes, scorpions, and anything venomous on the Maltese islands to lose their venom. Many went even further, claiming that the land of Malta was blessed by St. Paul and actually absorbed the toxins out of all venomous creatures living there. Then they started selling powdered Maltese limestone articles as medicinal cures to poisoning throughout Europe and North Africa. Terra sigillata melitensis, powdered limestone from the cave believed to have hosted St. Paul in Rabat, linguae melitensis, actually fossil shark teeth, and a whole host of other petrified artifacts were important medicinal exports for many a century, proof of Maltese ingenuity rather than the efficacy of the medicines. The clients could not have known that there were actually many poisonous and venomous organisms in Malta, some even capable of killing a human if ingested. St. Paul's viper has been identified by most Maltese traditionalists as Ilitka, I guess, the leopard snake Zemenis situla. The fact that this species is not venomous has not deterred them. St. Paul ceased to... Oh, no, wait, can't read tonight. St. Paul caused it to lose its venom when he came to Malta, is their usual explanation. Few want to know that the leopard snake also lives in much of southern Europe, and there it is venomous. Even fewer understand that a venomous species would face extinction if it lost its ability to incapacitate its prey quickly with venom. A more reasonable explanation given is that there could have been a venomous Maltese snake which has since become extinct. However, there is no evidence, fossil, documented, or otherwise, of a dangerous indigenous viper inhabiting Malta during historical times, and there is no evidence of an extinction event, such as the introduction of a predator or strongly competing species, that could wipe out an entire population of vipers while leaving other species of snakes alive. An alternate explanation is that the particular viper could have been carried to Malta with the wood St. Paul was collecting for the fire. Reptiles do disperse across seawater by hanging onto driftwood, so this theory seems plausible. However, the familiarity shown by the ancient islanders of Melita with the viper shows that this was a local species, easily discounting this theory. There are no records of venomous snakes ever in Malta capable of causing such severe symptoms. The species of snakes recorded in Malta could never have caused a man to swell up, fall down, and die, as in Acts. So what then is the identity of the viper that bit St. Paul? The best explanation is always the simplest and the one in which actual evidence occurs. In fact, the most dangerous true viper species in Europe does still live on the island of Melita. It is, however, not modern Malta, but an island in the Adriatic Sea, today known as Melita or Millet. Is that right? Millet, I think it is. Furthermore, Until recently, the island was so heavily infested with the notorious horned viper, Vipera amidites, that a predatory mongoose was introduced on the island in 1910 to control the snake population. The symptoms of a bite by this viper coincide with those reported in the acts: immediately swelling due to hemorrhagic edema, falling down due to faintness or dizziness, followed by circulatory shock, pulmonary congestion, and internal bleeding, all of which would lead to death if not treated properly. The Bible states that St. Paul's ship was in the Adriatic, Acts 27:27, when the shipwreck took place, but Maltese traditionalists have come up with several complicated nautical, archaeological, and other arguments to discount the Adriatic Melita as Paul's Island in favor of Malta. Unfortunately, the clear biological evidence proves otherwise. Thanks, Alexander. Fascinating. Never knew about any of that. And again, I would love to get a hold of an account of those Maltese legends about the Apostle. Probably a book with a title like The Maltese Apostle. Okay, gang, that's it for today's Bible Geek. Hope you enjoyed it. I sure did. I'll be back again tomorrow with yet another installment, another exciting adventure of the Bible Geek.